I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. I'd just like to introduce myself real quick. My name is Eric Wright. I'm the education specialist here at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Like I said a few minutes ago, welcome everybody. We're glad that you're joining these curator conversations with us. They've been really popular since we've started doing them, and my mask keeps falling down. I'm trying to adjust it. And we really appreciate the support that everybody gives our virtual programming here at the museum. And I'd also like to thank the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support as well, for providing these free programs. It really allows us, like we just got done mentioning, to engage not only our local population here, but we can reach out to places that we wouldn't have been able to reach out to before, and really engage everybody on some of these topics as they pertain to Wisconsin history and just the history of our military in general. As we go through the conversation today, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, please submit those questions through the chat board. We'll get to those questions at the end of the conversation, and we'll make sure that everybody's questions gets answered by our distinguished panel here, which includes our museum director, Mr. Chris Kolakowski, and also our curator of history, Mr. Kevin Hampton. And what they're going to be talking about today is basically the end of the war in the Pacific. And that's going to run kind of through the two bombings in Japan, through the 2 weeks or so after that, until we start looking at peace treaties being signed. So without any further ado, I will turn the platform over to Kevin and Chris. Gentlemen, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. And on behalf of Chris and myself, I want to thank everyone for joining us. If you're able to watch us live, excellent. This will also be recorded and available online. So if you're watching this after the fact, welcome as well. This is a follow-up kind of to our initial curator conversations back in May, when we talked about the end of the war in Europe and what did it mean for those that were actually still fighting in Europe, but frankly for those that were still fighting in the Pacific, because the war didn't end, as we know, in May of 1945. It kept going for several more months. So as I mentioned in May, if you were able to join us for that one, some kind of fun thing that Chris and I like to do is just pop into each other's offices and ask a philosophical history question and just see where the discussion takes us. And that was kind of where this type of program was meant to start, was give us a chance to really talk about events in history and how it relates to today, or how it relates to Wisconsin stories. So I hope you can follow us as we travel through this journey of the last 2 weeks of the war. Hopefully you've also had a chance to watch or read some of our blog posts that Chris has been authoring, and we've been filling with content from Wisconsin veterans, focusing on the last battle of World War II, which of course was Okinawa, and tracking the history of the last few months of the war in the Pacific, to wrap up our celebrations, or commemorations, excuse me, of the 75th anniversary of World War II. So today we're going to actually talk about the events of today, essentially 75 years ago. What was happening, these momentous events throughout these last 2 weeks, especially the last 2 weeks of July and the first 2 weeks of August, and how we got to this point. We're going to provide some context, those historical timelines of what you'll read in those personal stories in those blog posts. And if nothing else, we'll get started right away. Chris, unless you want to chime in on anything right away?
I can't add anything to what you just said, Kevin. I'm looking forward to a great discussion, though.
Fair enough. All right, we're going to start right out of the chute, because it's, of course, today marks the 75th anniversary of the day after the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki, and of course 4 days after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. And I think you can't talk about the end of World War II, obviously, without talking about these two events. But in order to understand these events, you also have to understand the context of these bombs, if you will, the historical context. You know, it's very easy. We were just talking, or Chris just mentioned, you know, in a history book today, especially like for mine, in my 5th grade history book, we essentially went from Pearl Harbor to D-Day, Battle of the Bulge, and then all of a sudden the bombs and the war was over in the course of 3 days of history classes in 5th grade and 8th grade. So you miss a lot in between, but it's those day-to-day events that really make the difference. So I just want to provide a little context about the bomb in particular, because those are going to be what we do talk about at length here today. And a big thing to remember is that, and Chris, I'm assuming you agree, is that the bomb isn't actually originally, it's not intended to win the war. It's not developed to end the war in the Pacific. It actually starts in Germany in 1938 and 39 with the scientific discovery of fission and the reactions and the possibilities of what that scientific discovery means. And of course, as we know, in 1938, Germany is frankly already preparing for war. In Europe, they're preparing for a quick and decisive campaign. But all these major players of World War II also can't deny these scientific expanses and this scientific, essentially this race of scientific development that is looming, especially on the verge of war. So really the development of the bomb becomes an arms race of like anything else, like the development of the dreadnought. 50 years.
No, that's absolutely true. And Harry Truman referred to it in a moment of glibness. You know, when he was thinking about it in 1945, he says it's a bigger cannon than what the other person has.
Right.
And it's only afterwards with the radiation and the additional testing, once people figure out that, no, this is not just another conventional explosive, that nuclear weapons get put into this other category that they occupy today. But you're right. It was, and ironically, a lot of the German scientists were expelled or fled Germany because they had some element of Jewish or some sort of what the Nazis termed undesirable elements. And so they end up coming and working in the Manhattan Project for the United States.
Right. And every country, every large player that we think of today, you know, you think of World War II, you think of who are the major players. You think of Germany, Japan, USSR, England, and the United States, or Britain and the United States. And each country actually had their own form of project. It was just the degree to which they had resources, space, and essentially time to allocate towards these project developments that dictated essentially who would get the bomb first. You know, it was very clear in 39, especially since, you know, the famous letter in August 1939 that gets presented to FDR, that there are potentials here for a massive developments in explosives and redefining warfare and explosives, especially used in warfare as we know it. So I think it's important to remember that this wasn't a United States project that was developed just to end the war in Japan or in the Pacific. It's not a bomb that was developed even, frankly, in the last year. This is something that had been in the works for the last 5. Since 1939, when the first scientific reports started coming out and they started seeing potentials, it was almost an inevitability, especially with a world on the brink of war, that somebody was going to develop the bomb. It's just a matter of when. And of course, as we go through the campaigns, the United States is still trying to also establish where is everybody at with the development of this weapon. And they want to be able, you know, you trust your allies, but you trust them as, you know, arm's length away until essentially the Quebec Agreement in 1943, where the British and Americans combine their efforts essentially. Right, Chris?
Yeah, that's correct. And the British actually provide some important resources to the Manhattan Project. And of course, the only reason that agreement is struck is, you know, something that happens not that far from us in Chicago in December of 1942, the first, you know, sustained chain reaction, ironically, under the football stands of the University of Chicago Stadium.
Yep.
And only then when it becomes, the bomb had always been theoretically possible. How it would work had always been theoretically possible. Now it was clear atoms could be split. This thing could actually be done. Mm-hmm. And when the United States had developed that, which is something not anybody else had really been able to take it to that point, the British here's what we need, here's what you need, here's what we can help you with. And then, of course, that's really when, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, Hanford, the sites that we associate with the Manhattan Project, that's when they really get ramped up as 43, 44, and then, of course, the tests in 1945.
The thing I find interesting, too, this is just a complete side note, about this, you said it there, the sites that we associate with the Manhattan Project. You didn't say Manhattan.
No.
I find that very interesting. We think about where did the origin of the name come from, and the fact that it starts in 42, really, in Manhattan, and that's kind of where the impetus for this whole project on the United States side comes from. But people don't remember it or associate the fact that it was essentially right in this metropolitan, massive metropolitan that this whole project started.
Yeah, Manhattan Engineering District.
Mm-hmm. I read somewhere too, I think that like all the uranium was on the docks in Manhattan that we had possession of from, I think it was either South America or Africa. So that's where all the, founding blocks of these reactions started, was in Manhattan.
I didn't know that. Interesting.
This is a multi-year project. This isn't something that, like I said, isn't just meant for the Pacific. It's not meant for anything other than the development of the possibilities of science, really. And of course, no one truly knows the full extent of what that all means until later on. But let's fast forward, of course, here. So the development over the years, of course, we can go into a whole different discussion for a long time about, how far did Germany get? How far did Japan get? We can certainly talk about that in the Q&A afterwards, but I want to get fast forward here to July of 1945, because that's kind of the turning point here. And I'm going to switch my share screen. So Chris, if you wouldn't mind getting us up to speed on what is happening in July of 1945 and how does it affect these next few weeks?
Well, by July of 1945, the war in Europe is over. It has been over since May 7th, 8th, 9th, depending on which city you sit in and what your perspective is. And so the enemy, the Axis enemy that remains in the field against the Allies is Imperial Japan. And Japan, by most rational calculations, has been effectively defeated. In 1942, let's put it this way, 3 years before, in July of 1942, it had ruled 1/7 of the globe. And by this point, its Pacific Empire had been wrested mostly from its control, although parts of what we know today as Indonesia, were still in their control, plus Southeast Asia. They still had elements in China. But for all intents and purposes, and you can see a schematic here, each of the numbers is an Allied amphibious landing, so you can see the progress of the Pacific War campaign and the Allied fight back. By the summer of 1945, the Allies, and it's mostly Americans, but there are some Allies, particularly English, British forces along with us, but there are a few others as well, stand at the gates of the home islands. One of the big things about this, though, and has given a lot of people pause, is that the battles have gotten tougher and they've gotten more costly as we've gotten closer to the home islands. Just to point out, the Philippines, liberating the Philippines, which is that cluster, if you scroll down a little bit, there you go. 49,000 total U.S. killed, wounded, and missing in those campaigns, or 47,000, excuse me, plus another 90,000 with disease and various. They kill over 250,000 Japanese just on the main island of Luzon in the southern Philippines as well, plus another 100,000 or so in Leyte from October 1944 to August 1945. On Okinawa, if you scroll up a little bit, which is basically it's a prefecture of Japan. It had been invaded April 1st. It had lasted 90 days. The battle was supposed to last 30 days. 49,000 U.S. killed, wounded, and missing, plus another 25 or 30,000 for disease and combat fatigue and various other causes. Of the 450,000 Okinawans, 82,000 are killed in the fighting. And of the 110,000 Japanese defenders, all but 7,000 die to a man in the defense. So what is happening is, and that's just two of the biggest, bloodiest battles. I'm not even talking about the stuff going on in Burma, where William Slim's army is destroying the Japanese armies out there. There's conflict going on in China. This actually has become a bloody war, a bloodier war as it's gotten closer. Unlike in Germany, where the German strength was sapping toward the end and Allied casualties were going down, by this point, the two bloodiest battles in the Pacific are the two that I just named. The liberation of the Philippines, which was the largest army campaign in the war, except for the Normandy to Central Germany campaign, by the way, and Okinawa. So the war is getting tougher. And the Japanese are showing no signs of, if anything, if they're showing any signs, they're not showing signs of quitting, and they're definitely showing signs, if anything, of being more fanatically resistant.
Exactly.
July 1945 is also an important month because it's the Potsdam Conference outside of Berlin, where the big three, who's now Harry Truman with Franklin Roosevelt being dead, there he is in the center, Winston Churchill, who's replaced partway through because he loses an election with Clement Attlee, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Churchill, of course, being British, meet to discuss not just the post-war Europe, and that's really where the map of post-war Europe, that's a whole talk for a whole other time.
Oh, yeah.
But this is also where they discuss, because the Soviets aren't in the war yet, they've promised to enter the war 90 days after the Germans have surrendered, which would be August 8th, August 9th. But they're not in the war yet, but Truman and Churchill decide to issue a proclamation to the Japanese, basically telling them to give up, or prompt and utter destruction will be visited upon you. They don't specify what that is, although the Japanese think they have something of an idea, because by this point, US B-29s have been bombing the home islands really since the previous June, but really in earnest since since June of 44, but really in earnest since the spring of 1945. In 3 raids on Tokyo, and this is a good example of a good zoom in here of what the B-29s did. In 3 raids on Tokyo, the first one is the deadliest single attack in the history of warfare, March 9th to 10th, 1945. They kill 83,000 Japanese, and by this point, they have obliterated, basically, they've reduced to ashes most of Japan's largest, I think, 63 largest cities.
Yeah, so each map, each smaller but capitalized city is one of the smaller urban industrial areas effectively neutralized just between June 15th and 14th of August.
There you go. That the picture's worth 1,000 words, so I'll let the picture do the talking. In addition, the average Japanese person consumes 1,300 calories a day. There are over 13 million Japanese homeless. This is out of a nation of 74 million, by the way. So feel free to do the math. I'm not a mathematician, I'm a historian, but you can do the math and a percentage on that. And Japan is rapidly no longer becoming an industrialized nation because of the B-29s.
Chris, are you telling me you don't want me to ask you to tell me about nuclear fission and how it works?
No, let's.
Because
there are far better minds that understand that stuff than me. I'll be the first to say.
I think you touched though on an excellent point, and it's that idea of total war, and it's something that we saw in Europe, especially with the industrialized areas of Germany, but this isn't new to World War II either. You have, of course, the German bombardments of London and other areas of England. You have this escalation of destruction essentially as the years go on through World War II, and it's culminating, of course, in these massive campaigns. And I think I saw a statistic that, what was it, between June and August, they dropped 65, or they did 6,500 missions, bombing missions into Japan alone in 3 months period of time, I think it was. Mm-hmm. Which is just a massive, it shows the massive, I guess, mobilization and the capabilities that these advancements, including especially the B-29. The B-29 it's almost a perfected bomber by the time it really gets fielded, wouldn't you say?
I would. Most expensive weapons system devised by the United States during the war, as a matter of fact. It cost them $3 billion to develop the B-29. and it was built to do exactly this. You had the RAF and you had the U.S. Army Air Forces in Europe with the B-17s and the Lancasters and the Sterlings and the Liberators. They were doing the job very well, but to be able to strike with a heavy payload over the long distances of the Pacific, it's 1,500 miles from their base to the home islands, one way. So, you know, that would be like bombing LA from here, essentially, from here in Madison.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then to be able to come back. And so that's what the B-29 is designed for. And it does its role, it does its job very, very well.
Indeed. I'm just going to bring up here, it wasn't one that I had prepped, but I want to show it because we essentially have segued right into a great chance just to show it off a little bit. This in particular, this B-29, if you read our last, or Chris's last blog post, the city of Baraboo, B-29, actually, if you notice where that flag comes out of, it comes right out of where you'd find Baraboo, Wisconsin. It actually has a very interesting role in the events of August 5th and 6th. Do you care just to quickly touch on that, Chris?
Sure. The orders for use of the atomic bomb, which had been dropped, and the bomb components had been assembled at the Marianas, both by plane, but also by the cruiser USS Indianapolis, most famously or infamously. So it was ready to go, and the orders come from Washington to bomb Japan with these weapons, of which there are 2 available, as soon as weather permits after August 3rd, 1945. And so because weather is so important, we look back and, well, oh, they dropped the bomb, it was successful, everything's fine. It was a problem, especially because the prevailing winds come from the west and the weather systems come from the west, and Japan owns all the territory to the west, Manchuria, Korea, places like that. So they have to schedule B-29 flights out over the target cities of Japan, which are primarily in the southwestern corner of Japan. And so these lone B-29s will go out and take weather observations to both get a feel for the weather, but also to see what's going on, what are the prospects. It's kind of like, you know, the famous with Eisenhower and preparing, you know, the weather forecast for D-Day in June of 1944. It's the same sort of thing. And on August 5th, 1945, the city of Baraboo draws the weather patrol, if you will, and flies that mission. And reports back, everything's clear over the targets, everything's fine. It does, you know, things are settled, you know, where things should be okay. And then 2 days later, with a bunch of antennas on top of it, after the bombing of Hiroshima, you go back, fly over it to take radiation readings, to see what it's done to the weather patterns, to see what's going on, what the air quality is, and a variety of other scientific readings from the bombing of Hiroshima. And the pilot, who's a man from Baraboo, obviously that's where the name of the plane comes from, later wrote about it and was later quoted in the local paper about it. And we use his story in the blog post. But it's a really interesting, and he even said, he's like, nobody talked about it. He said, but everybody understood this was something that could end the war and could solve our problems, was a direct quote from him. And from what I've been able to pick up from accounts of veterans, including my own grandfather, who was on the troop list for the invasion of Japan. We'll hopefully get to that shortly. Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of people felt that way. A lot of people felt this was a big deal. This could end the war. Let's see what we can do.
So I want to just backtrack a slight bit because this image, if you're familiar with pictures of the mushroom clouds, will look a little different than the ones that you've seen perhaps over Hiroshima or Nagasaki, because this is actually the Trinity test. And I find the timing of the Trinity test very interesting when you're starting to look at how these events unfold, because of course the Trinity test is actually on July 16th. And when does the Potsdam Conference start? July
16th.
Yep. Just so happens that Truman then has essentially the ability to tell his allies in Potsdam, Germany there, that they have a successful test. And he does indeed tell Stalin about the test. Mm-hmm. There's a report that Stalin secretly, or, you know, to Truman says, okay, and thank you. But then secretly afterwards contacts Beria and who's his, of course, is one of his chief of intelligence, and tells him that gets mad because he didn't tell him first, because up until this point, Stalin had been finding out about our advancements in the project and the timeline. He had known actually about the Trinity test, that it was going to be coming up, but he was upset that he'd been told before Truman had a chance to tell him. But anyway, so it's a very interesting timeline when you're looking at those last, because of course Trinity test the 16th, Potsdam runs from the 16th until August 2nd, but the Potsdam Declaration, which is an excellent quote you said there, Chris, the prompt and utter destruction. Essentially, it is word for word exactly what Truman ended it with: unconditional surrender, unless otherwise you shall face prompt and utter destruction.
That's July 26th is when that's issued.
26, right?
Right.
So it almost sets up for what we have to talk about, which is I'm sorry. I also want to talk about this too. The other thing to notice here in this image, and unfortunately, I don't think I can get closer to it. I'm going to try. There we go. Does that work?
Yep.
Is that it's not just increased in bombing runs and everything else. You've also got the entire, almost essentially the entire Third Fleet positioning now that Okinawa has wrapped up and it is essentially more secure. It's secure than it was before. You have this freeing up of assets, and you have the entire Third Fleet deployed along the coast of Japan here. And you can see, based off of this graphic from, of course, the MacArthur report, the times and dates. They all fall. When does the first one start? 17th, 18th of July, first days of Potsdam. So you have between, the 15th of July you have up here. But these are the naval offshore bombardments that are happening. These are the carrier-based sorties that are happening, hitting these industrialized cities or these urban industrial areas.
And you can see they're roaming up and down. The Japanese Navy is essentially done for.
Yep.
What hasn't been sunk is because of lack of fuel is pretty much immobilized at their piers, and that's not saying much. We're talking about, was it one battleship, 4 cruisers, and 1 aircraft carrier is all that's left of the Imperial Japanese Navy.
Yeah.
Where the United States, there are more battleships that were raised from, there was 6 or 7 times that number of battleships raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, to say nothing of new construction.
Right.
Ranged against Japan at this point, and they're going up and down the coast at will, going after the Japanese. So yeah, Japan is definitely getting pounded very, very heavily.
Well, and isn't the Japanese or the Japan Sea back here, isn't that mined too, if I remember correctly? Just heavily mined, almost a stranglehold is around the islands. Between
submarines and mines over there, the blockade of Japan is pretty much coming into full effect at this point. So there's absolutely no question the Japanese have lost control of the seas around most of the home islands. The Sea of Japan is still a little bit, they still can move things if they need to, but the rest of the home islands is transportation, land transportation and sea transportation is breaking down.
Yeah. I'm going to switch to the next one. So that kind of sets us up for what the situation is, wouldn't you say, for at least up to Hiroshima. And of course, the devastation of these bombs is undeniable. You can't deny that there's a clear devastation element to this. It's not just a strategic conversation part here.
No, I agree. As a matter of fact, I would argue that one of the greatest arguments and one of the greatest reasons we haven't had a third nuclear weapon is photographs just like you're showing right now, and the data that we have, because these bombs become, the benchmarks for assessing nuclear weapons in the future, potential effects, things like that. The bridge with the shadows burned into it.
You can see in the rungs of the bridge, but then also a shadow of a person right there they have crossing the bridge. And then you've got these before and after images of, here's Hiroshima with ground zero before, and here's Hiroshima after.
Yep.
You see the shadows of what used to be these city blocks. This, of course, is the famous image from the bank, the bank only a few blocks away, where somebody was, they believe somebody was sitting on the steps or crouching on the steps before the blast, and then of course the shadow afterwards. But the fires too are part of, if not a huge part of that initial devastation as well.
Absolutely.
The section completely destroying from the epicenter out. Again, not, to be honest, not terribly different than the firebombing of Tokyo and other places that had already happened.
That is true. If you read accounts of the Tokyo raids and then read accounts of Hiroshima, they read very similarly. One of the things that's very different, though, is the radiation.
Yes.
And whereas Tokyo was used, it was incendiaries and napalm, it burns. This is just utter and complete devastation.
Yeah.
And you think about these photos, you think about this data, and you think about the decision, how that might have influenced the decisions of Khrushchev and Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Or when you think about Cold War movies like Failsafe, or you think about Dr. Strangelove. This is how we know.
Yep.
This is an argument, and that's, you see that in the future.
Well,
Even Godzilla.
Right.
Is the Japanese reaction. The idea that nuclear bombs and then this thing comes out of the sea and burns down Tokyo and starts burning down other Japanese cities. That's something of a metaphor for what the B-29s and what the American fleet did in 1945.
Yeah. Yeah, now I'll never watch Godzilla the same again. Thank you for that, Chris.
You're welcome.
But that's also part of this. That's what makes these conversations so great, is to look at what are the effects, what are these moments in history that we can look at from different lenses and talk about, because you got to talk about them.
Right.
And of course, you see here the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima or Hiroshima, and then of course the mushroom cloud over Nagasaki. And I see these, and of course my immediate thought goes back to the comparisons, and like you said, it's used as a comparison for the next, actually through to today. How else do we understand the hydrogen bomb? How else do we understand, they say 10 times greater than the bomb that was dropped on, Hiroshima or Hiroshima. And you immediately, you can already see the infographic in that, Times Newsweek article that shows the mushroom cloud, but then shows it 10 times bigger. There's entire websites now that are dedicated to taking Google Maps, overlaying the destruction of one bomb and showing the radius if it was dropped, in Chicago or something like that. So it's all over. You can see it, but
Right.
That's what your constant is the actual effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, I asked you this last week. I'm going to ask you this again. We know that Hiroshima takes place on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th.
Correct.
And we also know that the USSR has promised FDR that it would take 3 months to get back in. Is it coincidence that Russia invades the exact same day that only a few hours later we drop the second bomb on Nagasaki?
Short answer is yes, because the 90-day window that I referenced earlier, Germany, and this is an interesting comment, because of the time difference, when Germany's surrender took effect at 11:01 p.m., May 8th, 1945, Moscow being an hour ahead was May 9th. So when the Soviets invade Manchuria and enter the Pacific War on the morning of August 9th, 1945, Stalin has completely fulfilled his pledge. Mm-hmm. And said, we're 90 days after Germany's surrender, which for him is the early morning of May 9th. 90 days later, we're going in against the Japanese. And so was it a shock to the Japanese that the Soviets were in? Yes. Were the atomic bombs a shock? Yes. Was it collusion on the part of the Americans necessarily and the Russians to work together to do this? Not necessarily. As a matter of fact, the bombing of Nagasaki, there's some accounts and some evidence that it was actually pushed up because they were concerned about the weather changing in the next few days. So it happens to work out the way that it does.
Well, and the fact that Nagasaki wasn't actually the primary target for the second bombing.
That's correct. Kokura was, which today is modern Kitakyushu.
Right.
But there was too much smoke and too many clouds, and they couldn't bomb visually.
Yep.
And so they flew over Nagasaki, and the clouds opened just enough over Nagasaki for them to be able to bomb.
Yeah. And I think it ties right back into those weather reports that they were doing, those flyovers for weather reports and everything, because it all is tying back into that there's so many moving pieces to all this. Now, I'm doing much better on time management this time than I think any conversation we've ever had before. So we'll dovetail into 75 years ago today, August 10th. And I'm hoping, so the bombs have dropped, and we can talk much more about that in detail in the Q&A, hopefully afterwards, if people want to stick around. But I would be remiss if I didn't touch on what is happening 75 years ago to the day, because at this point, Japan still hasn't surrendered. It hasn't officially notified the Allies that it's willing to even accept the Potsdam Declaration, because, of course, one of the components of the Potsdam Declaration is the understanding that Japan may, well, from the Japanese perspective, they may have to, or they're being asked to do away with their sovereignty of their emperor. And that's a huge sticking point, is the position of the emperor and perhaps the necessary abdication of the emperor or things like that. You know, you have to look at what happened in Europe, and you look at what happened to Mussolini, what happened to the other leaders of the Germany and things like that. What will be the future outcome of the Japanese leadership? But that brings us exactly to this moment, which is depicted in a painting again, from the MacArthur Report. You're welcome, Chris.
Yeah.
But Chris, I wonder if you can give us a little context of what we're looking at.
Okay, before I explain what you're looking at here, I want to start with the mentality. To understand this whole scenario of how the end of the war plays out, you have to understand certain facts about Japan and its outlook and the Japanese government. Okay, this is Hirohito and his Supreme War Cabinet. It consists of the emperor, the foreign minister, the prime minister, and then there's Emperor Hirohito there. And then the representatives, there's the Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, and then the representatives of the senior, the Army and the Navy. Now, here's the thing you need to understand. That's the Chief of the Army, General Onami Korichika. And then the Navy Minister, Admiral Toyota Somu. You have to understand something. The Emperor, in their minds, is a living god. He is a direct descendant of the goddess that founded Japan 2,600 years ago. There are Japanese that have never heard their emperor's face or emperor's voice. There are Japanese that believe that if you look the emperor in the eye, you go blind. Okay? That's the first thing. Second thing is Japan has never lost a war in her 2,600-year history. And these people are facing that. The third thing that needs to be remembered is that by law and by custom before 1936, by law, a serving officer has to be both the head of the army, the Navy minister, and the Army minister. So you showed us Onami and Toyota. They are active duty officers. By resigning, they can take down the government. What does this mean? This means that basically the military calls the shots and has a veto power over anything that the prime ministers do. You need to remember those three things to understand Japan's decision-making process in 1945. As Richard Frank recently pointed out, he says at the end of the day, the one city that was most important in the end of the war was Tokyo. And for my mind, the most important room in that building or in that city is the bunker underneath the Imperial Palace, which this meeting takes place. And this is where the Supreme War Council will meet in the presence of Hirohito. Now, normally when these meetings take place, and they've been taking place all through the war, normally when these meetings take place, Hirohito will ask questions. He won't necessarily say much. He will, by his silent assent, he will concur with decisions that are made. By his questions, he will guide. It was a question from Hirohito, as a matter of fact. What is the Navy doing to help defend Okinawa? That resulted in the Yamato making her last sortie in early April 1945.
And doesn't he usually ask through the Chamberlain? Isn't that it? Like he,
Yeah, Lord Privy Seal, Marquis Koichi Kiido, who is the gentleman standing up in the black suit, as a matter of fact. And so it's a very formal, ritualistic process. Hirohito, there's some new scholarship and some new documents that have come out that Hirohito, as early as August 8th, 1945, told his foreign minister, "We need to end the war." There had been a furious debate going on in this meeting when news of Nagasaki arrives, news of the Russian arrival arrives, and they debate for hours what to do. The military is there; they want to fight. Last decisive battle. The last time Japan had been invaded in force was the Kamikaze, the famous divine wind that had blown the Mongol ships back from whence they had come. Kublai Khan, way back in 1183, I think it was. They saw something like that potentially happening again. And Hirohito, 75 years ago today, makes what may very well be his finest moment, where he says, we must accept the Potsdam Declaration. You know, I want, you know, we need to figure out what the government will be. You know, there will be some points of clarification over whether the emperor will stay in power. But that moment is when he says, it is my wish. He doesn't say it's an order. It's my wish that we accept the Potsdam Declaration.
and he says it himself.
Yes, he does. And that's the key, because that's the key domino.
Yep.
That over exchange of messages, the Allies say, yes, the emperor, but he will be subject to occupation authorities, and then we eventually know it will be Douglas MacArthur. But that's the key moment, 75 years ago today, when Hirohito tells his government, it's my wish we do this. And that matters a lot, because people forget, people don't realize that on the night of the 14th, after Hirohito had recorded a broadcast that was going to go out on the morning of the 15th, there was actually a coup attempt by the Imperial Guards Division to stop the broadcast and continue the war.
Right.
What foundered it was the opposition of Anami and some of his senior officers, because Anami, as much as he hated the idea of surrendering, as a matter of fact, he would kill himself on the morning of August 15th so he didn't have to endure listening to his emperor give his orders to his people. But Anami did tell his superior, his staff and his subordinates, we will obey the order of the emperor. And that command, when it's the command of the emperor, who they all believed was a living God, no senior officer was going to back the coup attempt.
Right.
And so but imagine, I mean, that's what it took.
Oh yeah.
That's what it took to stop it.
Well,
it was very, very close.
Throughout the night, one of the accounts that I ran of the coup attempt, throughout the night, they're searching for these recordings.
Yes.
That is to make sure that the voice of the emperor doesn't get put out to the public, because they haven't heard him before. And
right.
If you can stop the voice of the emperor, you could essentially stop the surrender, if that's what the thinking was.
Well, and just one other thing as well is LeMay's B-29s drop leaflets over Japan with the text of the Potsdam Declaration and the text of Japan's broadcast accepting the Potsdam Declaration, subject to the assurance that the emperor will still be in office, or the imperial system will be maintained. So there's a lot of information starting to get out, and so this is kind of the last gasp to stop it before irrevocable information is released.
Yeah.
But it was close. If you read, actually, John Toland's Rising Sun as one of the outstanding accounts of that last 36 hours before Hirohito's broadcast. It's makes for absolutely riveting reading when you think about what's at stake and the many millions that are at stake with what's going on at that moment.
Yeah. So I'm going to fast forward a couple of days. So this is the stuff that would be coming up here after the emperor has issued his directive to his ministers, and after today, and of course the actual announcement of the surrender, which comes, of course, on the 15th of August. This will be a couple days after that. This is actually a neat, unique opportunity for us to share some photos from our collection. This is one of the unique photo collections, I would say. It's from Milton Emco of Columbus, Wisconsin. He actually he's serving as a gunner on a B-24 Liberator. And of course, we know that the B-24 Liberators are actually stationed on essentially one of the islands near Okinawa, on Ayashima. And it happens to be the same airfield that the Japanese delegation to come and discuss specific terms with MacArthur in Manila happens to stop at, to switch planes. So this is essentially the Japanese surrender plane landing on the airfield at Ayashima. I want to point out here the next image. You see that there? This looks like a forest. This looks like junk until I zoom in. That's all the crew and Army personnel and Navy personnel and Air Force personnel that gathered to see this plane arrive. And you can see it's on both sides. It's actually, there's no jungle next to that airstrip. It's all people. And if you do that same thing here in this photo, you can see that background that looks like shrubbery is just the sheer volume of people that are here to see this momentous event. And we have,
by the way, those are green crosses. One of the reasons that they wanted it painted white with green crosses, because no other Japanese plane had that color scheme. Of course, they had the red roundel for the rising sun.
Yeah.
That way, because the Americans actually, in the anticipation that somebody might try and shoot down these planes, as soon as they had come off the home islands, there had been a fighter escort that had shown up. And the code word, which I always thought was interesting, was baton.
Oh, wow.
And the recognition was, what's the recognition signal? Baton. And then the response was, we are Baton's protector. Follow us.
Wow.
So American fighters escorted them to this airfield where they transferred them to a C-54 and flew on to Manila to meet with MacArthur and his people. And that's another topic for a whole other time, is how MacArthur and the American stage managed the end of the war to begin the peace.
And that's kind of what I wanted to use as our dovetail. So this is a 3-part series, if you will. We started in May talking about the end of the war in Europe. We, of course, are talking today about the end of the war in the Pacific, but I hope you'll join us again here coming up in September or October sometime. I'm not sure exactly when just yet.
Whenever Eric tells us we're going.
Well, we do have some questions that we can get to. If we have just a couple minutes left, if I look at my clock, I think we do. Is there any other portion of this conversation that you two wanted to use to wrap up?
Did you lose me? I'm here.
Kevin?
Yeah?
I was just, before we get to questions, I was just wondering if there's any other information that you wanted to put out before we wrap this up.
Yeah, I think one thing I do want to say is that it's undeniable. We can talk, the debate about the bombs and the end of the war is still as relevant today as it was 75 years ago, or even 1946, 74 years ago. Even so much to the point that there was controversy in the 90s when there was an exhibit that was going to go up with the Smithsonian. And there will always be debate, I think, about the bomb, its use, should it have been used, alternatives. And I know Chris can go into a wonderful conversation during our Q&A here about alternatives and what we could have done, what could have been used, was there a feasible option? But one thing is undeniable, is that for the people that are on the ground, I'm just going to use this as a visual for me, for every person that was there on the ground, not in a decision-making level, not in a privy to confidential information level, but the ones that are actually doing the work, this truly was the event that ended the war for them. My grandfather was literally making his way from the East Coast to the West Coast. He'd been in Italy. They got on a troop ship as soon as the war in Europe ended, and they made it over to Virginia, landing in July, and they were on the trains on the way to the West Coast to get onto the boats to head to Hawaii and the Marianas in preparation for this invasion that they all knew would have to happen with Operation Downfall. When he got a letter from his former employer It was on August 12th, so before the Japanese actually surrendered, saying that I hope the news of last week means that you'll get to return to us soon. So it's undeniable to know that for those on the ground, they knew that these monumental events, these massive bombs that were used in this new scientific development after years of research, meant something different, but it also meant for them, there was a real reality that they may not have to actually go into another fight, which is something that is undeniable. Wouldn't you agree, Chris?
I would agree, and I would simply add this, that the first 15 days of August 1945, I would consider to be of a like period, one of the most, if not the most important 15-day periods in the history of the world. And if you want to look at its monument, look around at the world that we live in today. So with that, Eric, whatever questions we have, I'm sure we've got more than a few with this audience.
We do, gentlemen, and that was fantastic. You guys always do such a great job. You know, even as history students learn a lot just by sitting in on these conversations with you. The first question that we have comes from John today, and John would like to know if you can maybe just speak to any Wisconsin-based manufacturers that were involved as contractors or subcontractors, not only with the B-29s, but also with the atomic bomb production, maybe at Hanover or Oak Ridge or Los Alamos.
So we do have a few collections, or we do have a few examples in our collection of oral histories of individuals that were involved in the Manhattan Project, in the engineer elements, not, necessarily right there with Oppenheimer, but those that actually worked in essentially the office right next to him. And so there are definitely Wisconsin connections. I don't have them queued up at the moment, but I can get that if Chris can kill some time for me here.
Well, Kevin, while you queue that up, maybe I can move on to the next question, and we can send this one to Chris. I'm sure he's going to have a ton of information on this, and it comes in the form of what gave the Japanese military, especially the Army, such a strong position within the government.
That goes back actually to the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, and just the evolution of the Japanese government. Even dating back to Emperor Meiji being restored in 1868, with the help of the Japanese military, and there was a low-grade civil war that occurred in the 1870s. Was the Last of the Samurai. The film Last Samurai talks about it kind of, impressionistically. But the military, particularly in the 20s and 30s, as Japan is expanding, Japan is looking to, join the colonial race, if you will, in the Pacific. They start that as early as 1895 by taking over Formosa, what we know today as Taiwan. Of course, Korea in 1910. So the military plays a very important role in both executing and then formulating policy as well. And so they basically worked their way gradually in. And by the mid-1930s, it's enshrined in law that's the case. And that's something that when people think about, as you think about the debate, touching on it lightly, and I have a feeling we'll probably get into it a little bit more here in a minute. By Western calculations, Japan was defeated in 1945 and should have surrendered without the bombs. But by Japanese calculations, they still had a chance for victory. And that's why I dwelt on the power of the military, the mentality, is you really have to understand where they are and the agony that it produces. I mean, can you imagine being General Anami and being the war minister at the time that Japan suffers its first defeat in war? And so, but it's important to understand that mentality and where it comes from and how pervasive it is even by 1945, even by 1941. That's the case.
Yeah. This is not related at all to the question. I apologize, but it's something I want to talk about. So hopefully you can bear with me. One of the things that Chris and I talked about too is the reality of, actually, never mind. Nope. Hypothetical, we'll put it at the end, just for fun.
Well, Kevin, aside from the bit of research that you might have brought up while Chris was answering that, we do find ourselves at the end.
Sure. So I got a couple of ones that I can share with people, if we're game for it. And it's something that I'm going to send if I can. We haven't tried this technologically yet, but I'm going to try sending the link to the transcripts through the chat if anyone's interested in following up with those. But John, or Jenner John, Dale Jenner John, was actually one of the engineers that I was talking about. He was from Milwaukee, and he has an interesting story about being in the office next to, I'm going to send it right now, next to Oppenheimer in the process. And then there's another one, if I can bring it up and grab it for you here. Let's see here, Hugh Richards, originally from Colorado, but settled here after the war. He actually has a fantastic story about literally driving essentially a piece of uranium up to University of Minnesota. He had a uranium sphere in his glove compartment up to the University of Minnesota so that they could finish their part of the research project. So he just traveled with it, just driving down the highway. And he talks a little bit about his involvement in that as well. I'll send that along here shortly. One thing, do you want to open it up or you want me to do my hypothetical, Eric?
No, you can go right ahead into your hypothetical, Kevin. Absolutely.
Chris and I talked about this at length, and he's going to probably not be happy in bringing it back up again, but we talked about the development of the bomb, the atomic bomb, being an arms race, and each country was already working on it to some degree or another. Successful, obviously, we're only a couple, but the one idea that has stuck in my mind was somebody once asked me, would FDR have used the bomb? And it's a very interesting question because, of course, we'll never know by the time that it comes around to being used. Obviously, FDR is no longer president and he's no longer with us, but he does make it clear in some private correspondence that have been documented now in the archives, not our archives, but I think his archives, that he had someone had talked to him and asked him, you know, would he use it against Germany? And imagine if the bomb had been used in Europe. Just imagine, this is a terrible phrase because it has implications on both sides, but literally and figuratively, the fallout of using the bomb in Europe. You know, essentially you'd have to drop it somewhere that hadn't already been destroyed. You'd have to drop it. That was the candidate list of cities that they used. One of the qualifications was an undestroyed city, which is minimal at best in Germany. But imagine you have to coordinate with all your allies. You have to talk to the Russians, especially, which you don't want you don't want to share information with the Russians at all. To the extent that Leslie Groves, the general in command of the Manhattan Project, actually orders one of the German testing sites destroyed via bombing in April of '45 before the Russians can get to it. And it's in the Russian sector, it's in the Russian zone. So it's just a mission that wouldn't normally be happening, but he goes to the extent of ordering that all the way from the United States up through the chain of command to deny access of information of these projects to the Russians. And it's this retaining of information and making a monopoly, essentially, if you will, of information. So imagine if you dropped the bomb in Germany in '45. You have to share information with your allies. You'd have to let them know. You can't just unilaterally decide. Whereas in the Pacific, you don't have to actually coordinate with anyone but the British, because part of that Quebec Agreement in '43 was that both the British and the Americans would agree on the use of the bomb if it was ever finalized or when it was finalized. But the fact
and the Pacific was by agreement in 1942, when Churchill, and this is another talk for another time, effectively ended the British Empire in the Pacific. The Pacific was U.S. strategic direction. The Middle East was British, and the Mediterranean was British strategic direction, and was joint direction in Europe itself. So yeah, you've got much more freedom of action in the Pacific.
Right.
So.
And the fact that the B-29, they modified 15 B-29s to carry these bombs specifically.
Mm-hmm.
It won't fit in a B-17. It wouldn't fit in a B-24. It had to fit in the B-29. So you have this special run, if you will, of modified B-29s. And up until, frankly, up until the success of the Normandy breakout, the B-17 and B-24s were sufficient. So there weren't any B-29s in Europe at the end of the war anyway, by the time that the bomb was developed, because you didn't need it. Now, had D-Day not, Chris and I talked about this, had D-Day in Normandy not been successful, and you'd still need those long-range bombers, then they, Chris mentioned to me that they were planning on seeing the feasibility of deploying some B-29s into that theater of operations. But realistically, it was just unnecessary. And by the time the bomb is fully developed, you don't need it.
Well, gentlemen, we thank you very much for all your expertise today and for the fantastic discussion. I'm getting lots of notes on the chat board here, basically all saying the same thing. Thank you very much for another informative session. You guys both do a fantastic job, and we look forward to your next one coming up, which will be sometime in September, the very first session that we have planned for September. So look forward to that. And for everybody else out there, if you're interested in the rest of the Wisconsin Veteran Museum programming, you can always visit our website and find those dates and registration links. We certainly welcome everybody to attend all the virtual programming that we do, from our trivia nights to our drink and draws to our movie discussions, and then also our panel discussions that we have here like this today. Once again, thanks everybody for attending today. We hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Kevin, Chris, thank you very much, gentlemen. We greatly appreciate it. And we'll see everybody next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you much.